Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at international relations and internal politics.
Yeah.
We got a whole bunch of articles and interviews. Some of them are even in Russian. And we're going to be trying to uncover some interesting insights about the changing global landscape.
Definitely.
Particularly focusing around Ukraine and the new U.S. presidency under Donald Trump.
Yeah, you know what's really fascinating to me is how all of these different sources kind of come together.
Right.
And they paint this really interesting picture of uncertainty and transition, both in Ukraine and, kind of on a global scale as well.
Okay, for sure.
It seems like this new Trump administration is like really signaling a major shift in policy, particularly towards Russia and how they're going to be handling this conflict.
Yeah. And, we've got some very interesting perspectives here. Including an interview with Alexei Arestovich.
Oh, yeah.
Now, he's a prominent Ukrainian military and political analyst.
Right.
And he's got some very strong opinions about the current situation in Ukraine and how it's being handled.
His analysis really stands out.
Yeah.
Because he connects the dots between what's happening domestically in Ukrainian politics with this bigger, broader geopolitical game that's being played out.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Fair.
So Arestovich doesn't really hold back.
No, he doesn't.
He is very critical of Zelensky's government. And he argues that they've totally mishandled the war.
Right.
Betrayed the Ukrainian people and are desperately clinging to power, even though they've lost all competence and legitimacy.
It's a pretty harsh assessment.
It is.
But he kind of backs it up with a lot of details and observations.
Yeah, and he paints a very bleak picture of life in Ukraine.
Yeah.
He talks about censorship, economic hardship, and just this deep societal divide.
It's a country that's really struggling.
Yeah.
And he raises some really important questions about the motivations of all the different players involved here.
Yeah.
From Zelenskyy to Western leaders to Putin.
Right.
Like, what are their real goals here?
Yeah. What are they really trying to achieve?
Exactly.
And it's interesting how he links internal Ukrainian politics with this broader geopolitical game that's going on.
Yeah.
He suggests that Zelensky's totally out of touch with reality, that he's pursuing his own personal gain.
Right.
While the Ukrainian people are suffering.
Yeah, it's like he's accusing Zelenskyy of putting his own interests ahead of the country's. Gosh.
Yeah, he even brings up this really chilling point.
Yeah.
About the possibility of Zelensky's government orchestrating a false flag attack.
Oh, wow.
To sabotage peace negotiations and maintain their grip on power.
That's a disturbing thought.
It really is.
It makes you wonder about the lengths that some leaders might go to.
Yeah.
Just to hold on to power.
Yeah, and then when you look at Trump and his return to this whole America First policy, pulling out of agreements, focusing on border security, boosting U.S. oil production, you start to see how all these different sources are creating this sense of unease and uncertainty.
Yeah, like the rules of the game are changing.
Yeah.
And no one's quite sure what the new rules are going to be.
And speaking of oil, one article highlighted Trump's plan to potentially sell U.S. oil at $25 a barrel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a bold move.
If he follows through with that, it could totally undercut Russia's economy.
For sure.
And give him serious leverage in any negotiations with Putin.
That's a huge power play.
It is.
It's like he's saying, I control the oil, so I control the situation.
Yeah, and it seems like he's really eager to use that leverage to broker some kind of peace deal.
Right.
Not just in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But potentially in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well.
Like he's trying to be the world's peacemaker.
Yeah, he wants to solve all the problems.
Exactly.
The recent peace deal with Hamas that he helped broker could serve as a model for his approach to the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, like he sees a formula that works.
Yeah.
And he's trying to apply it in different situations.
His focus seems to be on achieving a swift resolution.
Yeah. He wants to get things done quickly.
He might prioritize a quick peace, even if it means pressuring both sides to make concessions.
Right.
Regardless of the outcome of the recent fighting in Donbass.
It's like he's saying, let's just end this war and figure out the details later.
Yeah, and these sources suggest a flurry of activity on the diplomatic front.
Oh,
with summits being planned and countries like Serbia vying to host a Putin-Trump meeting.
It definitely feels like we're on the brink of some major changes.
And Arestovich seems to think that Trump's desire for peace with Russia is almost a foregone conclusion. He predicts that the U.S. will push Zelenskyy towards a settlement. potentially leading to new elections.
Yeah.
And a complete political shakeup in Ukraine.
That's a bold prediction.
It is.
And it would certainly have significant implications for the future of Ukraine.
Absolutely.
It's like everything's up in the air right now.
So just to kind of recap what we've got so far.
Okay.
Arestovich paints a very dark picture of Zelensky's leadership and the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Trump is signaling a dramatic shift in U.S. policy, particularly towards Russia. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering on the diplomatic front.
Definitely.
It seems like we're on the edge of some major changes.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, for me, what really stands out is this convergence of all these powerful forces and the uncertainty it creates. We've got Trump's unpredictable nature, Russia's assertiveness, and a deeply divided Ukraine struggling to find its footing. It's like a powder keg waiting to explode.
And in the midst of all of this geopolitical drama, we have these other important trends emerging, like the rise of AI and the impact of climate change.
For sure.
One survey suggests that Gen Z in the UK is increasingly reliant on paid services for basic tasks.
Really?
Yeah. Some might see this as a lack of resourcefulness. But maybe it reflects a changing economic model, one where convenience and specialization are valued.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's not laziness, but adaptation.
And let's not forget the environmental angle.
Yeah.
The report on 2024 being the hottest year on record.
Wow.
Along with the potential for Lake Baikal not freezing over this winter.
That's crazy.
It's a stark reminder of the impact climate change is having around the world.
Definitely a wake-up call.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
We got these global power shifts, internal political struggles, the rise of AI, and the looming threat of climate change.
Yeah.
It seems like we're at a crossroads.
Absolutely.
A pivotal moment in history.
And one thing that's really crucial to remember is the human cost of all of this. Arestovich talks about the plight of ordinary Ukrainians, refugees, internally displaced people, families of soldiers killed in the war. And he criticizes the government for not doing enough to support them.
It's a powerful reminder that these political games have real-world consequences.
Exactly.
It's easy to get caught up in the abstract discussions of power and strategy. But ultimately, it's people's lives that are at stake.
That's right.
And that's why it's so important to pay attention to what's happening. To try to understand the different perspectives and to engage in thoughtful discussion about these complex issues.
We need to have these conversations.
Yeah, we can't just ignore them.
Exactly.
Now, let's delve a little deeper into some of the specific events and predictions that emerge from these sources.
Okay.
I'm really curious to hear your take on some of these things.
Me too.
Let's see what we can uncover.
Sounds good. One of the things that really jumps out from Arestovich's analysis is the argument that Zelensky's government is deliberately trying to block any kind of peaceful resolution to the war.
Yeah, it's a really tough thing to wrap your head around. Why would they possibly do that?
Exactly.
It seems like it would be in everybody's best interest to just end this conflict.
As soon as possible.
Yeah.
Well, what Arestovich is suggesting is that Zelensky and his kind of inner circle are really afraid of the political fallout that would inevitably come with any sort of peace agreement.
Okay.
They've invested so much in this narrative of, you know, Ukraine being this heroic David fighting off the Russian Goliath. And so they're terrified of appearing weak or like surrendering if they were to actually make any kind of concessions to Russia.
So they're more worried about their own image and how they look than actually, you know, trying to save lives.
That seems to be what Arestovich is implying.
Well,
yeah, it's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah.
And he even goes so far as to claim that there was actually a peace deal on the table back in early 2022.
Oh, wow.
But that Zelensky personally sabotaged it.
Really?
Yeah. He claims that all the major points had already been agreed upon.
Wow.
Except for this one sticking point.
Okay.
Which was the size of Ukraine's military. So Russia was demanding that Ukraine reduce its armed forces as part of the deal.
Okay.
And Zelensky just absolutely refused to budge on that point.
So essentially what Arestovich is saying is that Zelensky deliberately chose war over peace.
I mean, he doesn't say it in those exact words, but he very strongly implies it.
Right.
He points to the fact that both Putin and Trump have repeatedly stated that they're open to negotiations and they're willing to work towards a settlement.
Right.
But he claims that Zelenskyy keeps moving the goalposts.
Yeah.
He keeps making these really unrealistic demands and generally just acting in a way that seems deliberately designed to derail any kind of peace talks.
And Arestovich is directly linking this intransigence to Zelensky's political ambitions.
Yeah, he's essentially saying that Zelenskyy is this power-hungry puppet of Western interests.
Wow.
Who's willing to sacrifice Ukrainian lives to advance his own career and enrich his cronies.
And he even goes so far as to suggest that Zelenskyy is actually actively working against Trump's peace efforts.
Right.
He claims that Zelenskyy is deliberately provoking Russia with things like these alleged attacks on the Kremlin or the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, that's a really serious allegation.
It is.
What evidence does he have to back that up?
Well, he doesn't offer any concrete evidence in the interview.
Okay.
But he does point to the fact that Western intelligence agencies are reportedly factoring these kinds of false flag operations into their assessments of the situation.
So he's basically suggesting that Zelenskyy might be willing to stage a terrorist attack just to make Russia look bad and justify continuing the war.
That's what he seems to be implying.
That is a chilling thought. It's really hard to believe that any leader would go to those lengths just to hold on to power.
I know, it's a disturbing thought.
And it's not just rhetoric, right?
No.
We're seeing reports from the front lines about things like the fall of Touretsk or Dzержinsk, as it used to be called.
Yeah.
And the ongoing fighting in Chasiv Yar. It really sounds like things are getting worse for Ukraine.
Yeah, and yet Arestovich is claiming that the Ukrainian government is still clinging to this fantasy that they can somehow win this war.
Wow.
They're spinning these defeats as strategic retreats, and they're demanding more and more weapons from the West.
Wow.
And Arestovich just thinks they're completely delusional and out of touch with reality.
It's interesting because it's not just Arestovich who's saying this.
Right.
We see some of the other sources as well, particularly those coming from Russia, that are suggesting that a Ukrainian defeat is basically inevitable at this point.
Yeah, they talk about Russia achieving all of its objectives, securing its territorial gains, and ultimately forcing Ukraine to just accept a peace deal on Putin's terms.
And this kind of ties into another important point that Arestovich makes, which is the potential for chaos and instability in Ukraine after the war finally does end.
Absolutely.
He warns that with hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers returning home, to a shattered economy and this deeply divided society, that things could very easily spiral out of control.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. And he even uses the term Hatamonism.
Yes.
Which sounds kind of ominous.
It does.
It sounds like he's predicting some kind of Wild West scenario where you have warlords taking over different parts of the country.
That's exactly right. He's warning about the possibility of Ukraine basically descending into this chaotic state with all these powerful warlords taking control of different regions.
Wow.
Almost like a modern day Wild West scenario.
And just think about what that would mean for the people of Ukraine, who are caught in the middle of all that.
It's a very scary thought.
It is.
And Arestovich puts the blame for this potential violence and instability squarely on the failures of Zelensky's government.
Right.
He argues that they haven't done nearly enough to prepare for the economic and social challenges that will come with rebuilding after the war.
Yeah.
And he believes that their incompetence and corruption have basically created a breeding ground for extremism.
It's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is.
But on the other hand, you have people like Julian Rapuk from Build.
Right.
And some of the Russian military bloggers who almost seem gleeful about the prospect of a Ukrainian defeat.
Yes.
Like they relish the idea of Russia asserting its dominance and crushing any hope of Ukraine ever joining NATO or the EU.
Yeah. And that's a really important reminder that there are powerful forces on both sides of this conflict who stand to benefit from it continuing.
What's interesting to me is how Arestovich frames this whole conflict.
Right.
He doesn't really see it as some kind of heroic struggle for freedom and democracy.
No.
But more as this cynical power play that's being orchestrated by these foreign interests with Ukraine caught in the middle.
Yeah.
It's a very sobering perspective.
It is.
And it raises some really uncomfortable questions about the role of the West in all of this.
For sure.
Have we been too quick to arm Ukraine without really thinking about the long-term consequences?
Right.
Have we been too eager to escalate the conflict without really exploring all the avenues for a peaceful resolution?
Those are really important questions for us to consider.
They are.
And as Arestovich points out, the people who are ultimately paying the price for this conflict are ordinary Ukrainians. They're the ones who are caught in the middle of all this geopolitical maneuvering.
So where does that leave us?
Well, Arestovich seems to think that Trump is basically going to push for a peace deal no matter what Zelenskyy wants.
Okay.
And that this could potentially trigger a wave of political upheaval in Ukraine.
That seems to be his prediction.
Yeah.
And it definitely sounds plausible. What's less clear is what the terms of that peace deal would actually be.
Right.
And who would ultimately benefit from it.
Exactly.
Would it be a genuine compromise that actually satisfies both sides? Or would it just be a way for Russia to solidify its gains and increase its influence over Ukraine?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah. And Arestovich doesn't hold back in his assessment of Zelenskyy.
No, he doesn't.
He basically accuses him of being corrupt and incompetent, a dangerous demagogue who's leading his country to ruin.
He paints a pretty unflattering portrait.
He does.
But it's not all doom and gloom. Okay. He does offer a glimmer of hope as well.
Okay.
He argues that Trump's election could actually represent a new opportunity for Ukraine.
Okay.
A chance to break free from the corrupt grip of Zelenskyy and his cronies.
Right.
And start building a more just and prosperous future.
That's a more optimistic take.
Yeah.
But that future depends on a lot of big ifs.
Yeah.
If Trump can actually deliver on his promise to end the war, if Ukraine can avoid descending into this chaos and atomism that Arestovich is talking about.
Right.
And if the Ukrainian people can find a way to heal these deep divisions that this conflict has created.
It's a tall order.
It is.
But it's not impossible.
So we're left with a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And the potential for things to go very wrong. But there's also this possibility for positive change.
Absolutely.
I think one of the most valuable things about Arestovich's analysis is that it forces us to look beyond those kind of simplistic narratives that we often get from the media.
Right.
And really confront the complexities of this conflict.
I agree.
Now, there's another interesting theme that runs through these sources. And that's the idea that Trump's return to power actually represents this broader shift away from the kind of liberal globalist order that has dominated Western politics for the past few decades.
Right.
Are you talking about that right turn that a lot of commentators are observing?
Yeah.
Not just in the U.S., but in countries like Hungary, Poland, and even parts of Western Europe.
Exactly.
One of the sources that we looked at in an interview with a Russian political analyst suggested that this shift might actually be more about a backlash against the state itself than about any specific ideology.
Interesting.
He argued that people are just feeling increasingly disempowered.
Yeah.
Alienated by big government, bureaucracy, censorship, and just the general erosion of individual freedoms.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It suggests that this right turn that we're seeing might actually be more of a populist revolt than a traditional ideological movement.
Right.
It's about people just wanting more control over their own lives, more say in how they're governed, and more protection from what they perceive as the excesses of the state.
And that connects back to something that Arestovich talks about in his interview, the importance of individual liberty and the dangers of unchecked state power. He argues that true democracy isn't just about holding elections, but it's about empowering citizens to hold their leaders accountable.
Right, shape their own destinies.
Exactly.
And he's very critical of Zelensky's government for its kind of authoritarian tendencies. Its crackdown on dissent and its disregard for the rule of law.
He argues that these actions are not only morally wrong, but also counterproductive because they undermine trust in the government.
Exactly.
And just create this climate of fear and resentment.
And this isn't just something that's happening in Ukraine. We're seeing these same trends playing out all over the world. People are losing faith in traditional institutions, becoming disillusioned with the political process. And they're seeking out alternatives.
And often those alternatives are coming from the fringes. From these populist leaders who promise to shake things up, drain the swamp, and give power back to the people.
It's a very volatile mix. It feels like we're on the edge of something big. Something that could fundamentally reshape the entire global landscape.
Absolutely.
And I think it's more important now than ever to stay informed. Engage in critical thinking. And not be afraid to ask tough questions about the forces that are shaping our world.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at some of the specific predictions and insights from these sources.
Sure.
I'm really curious to hear your take on some of these things.
Yeah, let's dive in.
You know, one thing that really stuck with me was this idea that Trump might actually use his control over the global energy market to try to force both Russia and Ukraine into some kind of peace deal.
Yeah, that's definitely a recurring theme in a lot of these sources. They highlight Trump's pledge to really boost U.S. oil production.
Right.
And potentially even sell it at $25 a barrel.
Which is crazy.
It's a really low price.
Yeah.
And if he actually follows through with that, it would be a huge disruption to the global energy market.
It would totally shake things up, especially for Russia.
Right.
Because they're so reliant on oil exports for their economy.
Exactly.
It seems like Trump is totally willing to use this kind of economic leverage to achieve his geopolitical goals.
Yeah, he's not afraid to play hardball.
And it's a strategy that could have ripple effects way beyond Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the potential impact on OPEC.
Right.
Or on global energy prices in general.
Yeah, they could fluctuate wildly.
And it could even affect the transition to renewable energy.
Yeah, one move by Trump could have these huge consequences for the whole world.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
And then there's this whole other issue of AI.
Right.
And its potential to disrupt society as we know it.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about that survey from the UK showing that Gen Z is becoming increasingly reliant on these paid services for even really basic tasks.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what skills are even going to be valuable in the future.
Right, like what are kids even going to need to learn?
Exactly.
If AI can just do most of the jobs that humans are doing now.
Yeah, it's a really interesting trend. Some people see it as a sign of laziness.
Right, like kids these days are just spoiled.
Yeah, but I think it might be more about adapting to a world that's changing really rapidly.
Yeah.
As technology keeps advancing, specialization and outsourcing just become more and more common.
Right.
So maybe this is just kind of the next logical step in that evolution.
But it does raise some big questions about the future of work.
Yeah, for sure.
Like what happens when AI can do almost everything? How do we even begin to prepare for that kind of shift?
Those are questions that we really need to be thinking about right now. We need to be adapting our education systems and our economic models to prepare for a future where AI plays a much bigger role than it does now.
And speaking of big challenges, we can't forget about climate change.
Yeah, that's a big one.
The sources we looked at paint a pretty alarming picture.
Yeah.
2024 was the hottest year on record.
It's crazy.
And there's a chance that Lake Baikal might not even freeze over this winter.
I know, it's really scary.
It's a clear sign that climate change is happening right now.
Yeah, it's not some far-off threat anymore.
And the choices we make today are going to have huge consequences for generations to come.
Absolutely.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener?
Yeah.
These sources suggest that we're entering a period of just unprecedented uncertainty and change.
Yeah, it feels like the world is in flux.
And the old rules of international relations and domestic politics, even just like work and daily life, they may no longer apply.
Right, like the old playbook doesn't work anymore.
We're witnessing this convergence of all these really powerful forces.
Yeah.
You've got Trump's unpredictable presidency, a resurgent Russia,
right,
the rise of AI, and the accelerating pace of climate change.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It really is.
But I think there are a few key takeaways here.
Okay.
First, pay close attention to what Trump is actually doing on the world stage. His America First agenda and his willingness to use this kind of economic leverage could have a really major impact on everything.
Right.
From the war in Ukraine to global energy prices.
Second, don't underestimate the potential for instability and conflict. We need to take Arestovich's warnings about the potential chaos in Ukraine very seriously.
Yeah, those are not empty threats.
Similar patterns of violence and fragmentation could emerge in other parts of the world.
Absolutely.
Third, be critical of the information that you're consuming.
Yeah.
We're constantly bombarded with propaganda and spin from all sides. So developing your own discernment skills and seeking out diverse perspectives is more important than ever.
I agree.
And finally, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
Challenge assumptions.
Right.
And engage in these thoughtful discussions.
We need to talk to each other.
We're all in this together.
AR.
And the only way to navigate these really turbulent times is to work together. Share knowledge.
Right.
And try to find some common ground.
I think that's a great point to end on.
Yeah.
Remember, this is just a starting point. We encourage you to dig deeper, explore these sources for yourself, and draw your own conclusions.
And until next time, keep diving.